should have a message like console.log. So connected to database. It should display this message. But it is an ordinary method. So if it is an ordinary method, so I will run this and see now. Yeah, let's run this and see. So tsc demo.ts and node demo.js. Now it is showing record inserted, but it is not showing connected. So the point is, if without connection any operation is performed, then my database will reject it. Means my server will reject it. It will say that first we need to connect. So the point is, connection is defined in a ordinary method. Then obviously every normal method we have to execute. You have to manually call it. So currently you can see here, it is calling insert. It is not calling connect. That means we have to call before inserting oracle.connect, then insert. That means this connection to database should happen regularly, every time. So that means when I start interacting with the database, the first thing should happen is connect and keep it ready so that my application can start using it for inserting, updating, deleting and all. That means I want this to happen automatically. If I want it to happen automatically, we want it to happen automatically. And it should happen immediately when the class is loaded into memory. That means I want some initializations. Remember the term initializations. I want some initializations in the memory. At the time of loading the class, I need to configure some initializations in the memory at the time of loading the class into memory, so that other members in the class can use those initialized values, can use those initializations. In that case, we want a special type of method which can do that work at the time of loading the class into memory. And that special method is constructor. So constructor can do this. We don't need to explicitly call it. Constructor can do it. It loads into memory and executes automatically. Whenever the class is loaded, constructor executes automatically. So that is the reason why generally when people learn programming and we ask what is the purpose of constructor, then immediately they say constructor is used for initializing values. Am I right? Constructor is used for initializing values. Am I right? But not actually. So not correct. So constructor, you don't restrict the role of constructor only for initializing the values. That means constructor have more broader scope of functionality. It was having more broader scope than the functionality that you know. That means we restricting the constructor to initialize values. But that is not only the work that a constructor does, right? So if you say that constructor is used for initializing values, that means you have mentioned about one of the use of constructor, right? You have mentioned one of the use of constructor, but actually constructor is not initializing values. Actually, it is initializing the memory for implicitly. Those type of tasks can be given to constructor. That means, so constructor initializes memory in a class. Constructor initializes memory in a class, initializes memory in a class, where initializes the memory in a class where it can load functionality. It can load functionality that executes implicitly, where it can load the functionality that executes implicitly. That means we don't need to manually call it. It will do that. In that, one can be initializing of values also, but not just initializing of values. So constructor initializes the memory, so where it can load the functionality and execute implicitly. That's what generally constructor does, the purpose of constructor. So here in TypeScript, generally in TypeScript, that means you may ask like, what kind of things can be done through constructor? What kind of things can be done through constructor? Some configurations we need at the time of application loading. That means when application loads, some configurations we need to keep ready so that the other components can use those configurations and work with them. Such tasks are performed through the constructor. That means at the time of loading the application, it will keep some functionalities ready. So at high level, that means in our Angular level, if we ask like, that means web technologies level. So if we ask like, what kind of such tasks? Like, so it includes actually like routes, like static files, right? So that means the concepts, we haven't learned about anything routing and all, we will discuss about them. Like routes, like static files, and like site memory, like values. So many things will be there. So currently we don't know about any routes and all. So better we will discuss about this in a next level. So when we start working with our Angular part, you will understand that the general level is values, initializing the values. That is the general level. But more than that, so many tasks can be done, just like I showed you. So we established a connection with the database. So now the other operations can be performed. So that's how a constructor can do. And important is TypeScript constructor is designed by using constructor keyword by using constructor keyword. And another point is it is anonymous. anonymous method. Anonymous method, that is no name for constructor required explicitly. Constructor, no name for constructor required explicitly. So class name is implicitly used for constructor. Class name is implicitly used for constructor. So constructor is a method and it is an anonymous type. Anonymous type means method without a name. Already I told you methods without a name. So in callback mechanism we discussed about it. So constructor is an anonymous method. So how do we write a constructor? How do we define the constructor? So let's go here. And here you can see before inserting record, connection should happen automatically. Then I will give this work to a constructor so that I need not to call it. So how we can give the work to a constructor? So I will change this to a constructor now. So by using the keyword just constructor, and constructor is a method and it is a special type method. It is an anonymous method, so it will not have any name. Constructor is the keyword used for creating a constructor. And this constructor name is automatically class name. You can see it takes the name of the class implicitly. So you cannot define any another name. So you cannot define any name for constructor. It's not valid. So it takes implicitly the class name. And important is when memory is allocated here, you can see new database. That means we are allocating memory for the class. When memory is allocated for the database, you can see when I move the mouse onto it, you can see, say, constructor is also loaded. The constructor is also loaded. That means the memory is allocated. Into that memory, the constructor is loaded. In many technologies, because constructor is an anonymous function, to call anonymous function, because it is an anonymous function, to call anonymous function, so usually we use, to call the anonymous function, we use here a parenthesis like this. So that is constructor related values. If constructor is expecting any parameters, it is constructor related values. But currently our constructor is not taking any values. If constructor is not taking any values, then it is not necessary to do this. So you don't need to mention about that parenthesis. That parenthesis is for parameters of constructor of that particular class. That means if class is having a constructor with parameters, then the parameters of that constructor are passed in this parenthesis. That means this parenthesis is related to constructor. It is related to constructor parameters. Currently our constructor is parameterless. So no need to define this, not required. Okay. Now I will run this and see. Here we are calling only insert method and I am calling and see here what will happen. When I call this, usually you can see the constructor executes automatically. That means the functionality defined in the constructor will execute automatically, implicitly. So that is how generally a constructor is defined, means how a constructor is called. You don't need that parenthesis. You don't need that parenthesis. So why? Because that is only for constructor when it is expecting some arguments into it, right? So that means here we define like this. So class demo, a simple syntax here. So, and here we have a constructor, and inside some functionality can be defined. Now, when we create an object, new demo, like this, that means parameterless, parameterless, parameterless constructor is called. Parameterless constructor is called. Now I defined let and obj is equal to new demo. That means this is parameterized. That means arguments for constructor can be passed. Arguments for constructor can be passed. Even if the constructor is not expecting parameters, even you can write this one. That means it is parameterless only. No need. By default, it is parameterless only. By default, it is calling parameterless. Parameterized constructor, its arguments must be passed. In that case, this is mandatory. Let's check that also. Example. This is one example. This is one example. So constructor is called automatically. Okay. Second point here is, the second point is constructor can be parameterized. Constructor can be parameterized. So the arguments are passed into parameterized constructor at the time of allocating memory, for class, at the time of allocating memory for class. Now many people will state this in a wrong way. So if you are still having that in your mind, then change that definition now. Why? Because see, many people, when I ask here, suppose this constructor is saying connected to database. Okay. Here I am using DB name, database name. It is a string type. And here I will say connected to, and $DB name, which database name that I have defined. Now you can see that here it is showing error. Why? Because this time class is having a constructor with parameters, and the parameter is a mandatory parameter. Can I make this optional parameter? Yes, I will make it question mark. Then if it is optional parameter, then it will not show error because it is optional parameter. But if you run this now, obviously it will show undefined database. Why? Because value is not supplied into it, and you are using it. Then obviously it will say undefined. That means here you can write a logic. If DB name is equal to undefined, then what should happen? Console.log. So here I will say connected to unknown database. That's message should come. Else, then it should handle this situation. That means it should be saying that connected to that particular database. That means now you can see that because it is an optional parameter. When it is an optional parameter, then you can directly handle like this. Now you can see that. So I am not mentioning the database, and I will run this, compile and run this. Then obviously it should say connected to unknown database because database name not mentioned. Now I am writing here into the constructor. We are passing the argument, that is Oracle. Now see, what many people tell when we ask question here is, when we ask question, when I should pass parameter, when I should pass parameter, when I should pass the arguments for the parameter in constructor, then many people generally tell the answer that at the time of creating object. Am I right? Many people answer this as at the time of creating object. Am I right? Right? Many people tell that at the time of creating object. Actually, creating object is finished here. LET Oracle object created. So that is wrong answer because object is created, but memory is not allocated. For that object, what type of memory need to be allocated? Which data that object has to use? We have to tell that by using new. And what is new? Already we discussed it. New is in the operators I told you. New is dynamic memory allocating operator. New is not a keyword. New is an operator. You should never say new as a keyword. New is not keyword. New is an dynamic memory allocating operator. In special operators, I told you about that. We have delete. Yeah. Memory allocator. That means it allocates the memory. Actually, it assigns memory. Am I right? It assigns memory. Am I right? It assigns memory for that particular class. If it is assigning memory, then it cannot be a keyword. It should be an operator. An operator only can do some assignments. Am I right? An operator only can do some assignments. So it is good to tell that. So generally the operators are used. You may say that in Java we call keyword, right? But what is a keyword that you examine about that later? That means what is a keyword and what is a new, means operator technically. So why? Because here, if it is a keyword, the concept of keyword is why you generally call as a keyword. Many people say that keyword means reserved word, sir. Right? So it is a reserved word. Then why we called delete, in, off as operators, not as keywords? Because generally a keyword is used to build the expressions or statements, to build the statements. Actually, we use keywords for building the statements. And dynamic memory allocator here, that means it is assigning memory. So better we will use the word operator, because assignments are done by operator, right? So dynamic memory create allocator. Okay, so that means it will create memory dynamically and it assigns memory, right? any expression is assigning memory is actually anything is assigning something, then it is actually an operator. Leave it with your Java, right? So here, this all comes under the category of special operators because it is assigning memory. Obviously, I think when you are using your Java classes or some other .NET classes, can you call the class directly like this without using the parenthesis? Can you do that? You cannot do that. But here it is working fine. Am I right? That means here new is working as an operator which assigns memory. So because memory is already created and just assign the memory. So in other technologies, you have to create the memory, load the memory, assign the memory. In that case, you may call it as keywords. But finally, it is assigning memory, right? In this case, what happens is generally this is just assigning the memory, and into this we are passing the database name. Some Oracle like this, we are passing that. That means, so never say that the arguments are passed into constructor at the time of creating object. Always say that at the time of allocating memory, not at the time of creating object, right? So that will be a correct option. Now we can see if database name is passed, then it is able to execute. That means it is connected and it is configuring and working fine. So that is how we are handling this. So a constructor, technically a constructor can be defined inside a class with parameters or parameterless. So parameterized constructor means the arguments are passed into the constructor at the time of allocating the memory. So that is how a constructor works. Now, so many points are there. So many points here means actually this is not end of constructor, because lot of things are related to constructor. One another, all are related to constructor. Many things are related to constructor, which we will see that step by step we need to understand them. Okay, first if you understood this point, the second option is, so constructor, when we are defining the accessibility for constructor, what do you mean by written this, Ankit? Constructor returns this. What is this? What this? This keyword. This keyword is not only for constructor, anywhere in the class to access the members in the class, we can use, right? And your intention is to tell that in the memory of the current class, to access anything, we use this keyword, right? So this keyword is not just constructor, it is related to entire class. It is to return the current class, not the current constructor. I hope it is the same in your Java also, right? That means it is not related to constructor only, right? It is related to class, right? Fine. Now the point is here, constructors, when we are defining constructors, now one question is, can we have access modifier for constructor? Access modifier for constructor. So that means suppose public constructor, it is having an access modifier, public constructor. So a private constructor, we are configuring a private constructor, and we are having a protected constructor. So that means we are defining a protected constructor. That means, can we define the access modifiers? So for constructor, important is constructor is a method. Then the key point here is we are defining various options. For example, see here. So we have protected constructor, we have a public constructor. So when we define the public constructor, everything looks great, good. It's working fine. That means the constructor is working fine. The constructor is working fine. It's working fine, no problem. By default, the constructor is public in access. That means by default, constructor is public in access. It is public in access. Constructor is public in access. Now the point is, can I create a private constructor or a protected constructor? So for example, I defined the constructor as private constructor. Actually, the private constructor, generally when we define a constructor as private, now the private constructor will prevent instantiation. Instantiation means it uses a security mechanism, and it will not allow to create an object for this class, right? It uses a security mechanism, and it will not allow to create an instance. Actually, private constructor can do two things. One, it will not allow this class to be instantiated. Object cannot be created. So that means you cannot create an instance here. So that means if it is private, that means it is accessible. Constructor of class is private and accessible within the class declaration only. You know that anything is defined as private, it is accessible within this. So now the point is many times asked is how we access this constructor. Suppose before inserting, I want to call, that means you cannot create like this. You cannot create like this. We cannot access. Suppose I am not mentioning about the constructor. So even I defined allocate the memory, it will not allow to instantiate. That means memory is not allocated because now the class is protected, restricted to access only within the scope. Within the scope. Generally, that means now we created Oracle and we defined the type of Oracle as database. I'm using the type as database. I'm using the type as database. Now it is possible. That means what is the purpose of a private constructor? Generally, a private constructor is used in a class to define the class as a type, to use the class as a type. That's the reason we generally call user-defined types. Class is also called as user-defined type. I hope you know that. Class is also called as a user-defined type. So it is an user-defined type. That means we can configure our own type. When we are using the class as an user-defined type, and through that we are accessing that insert operation here now. That means I'm using as a type database. It is type database. And I'm executing this now. Compile and run this. When I'm compiling and running this, now you can see some problem. So it says that I cannot use this insert. Because once you decided to use a private constructor, that means you are decided to use this as a type. And when you use this as a type, so the type can contain only the declaration of the members, which needs later implementation. Later implementation. That means this is Oracle is of type class, this database. Now what I am doing is, so into this, I am passing the value like this. Now here, what is the function available? We have an insert function available. What this insert function has to do, it should perform an operation console.log, and it should show the message record inserted. Record inserted. That means we have to define in this way. It needs an implementation for that. And that means here, the insert function that you mentioned, the general insert function you mentioned, so it is not having any functionality. So it is not having any functionality. That means it is empty. So it is just empty. It is not defined with any functionality. It's just empty. This is not the right way. This is what we are going to discuss in the next level of our concept. That is what we call as abstraction, right? We will learn about that. I'm interrelating every topic here, right? So that you can understand. So now the point is, we are not allocating memory newly for this database, because memory cannot be allocated for this database because it is having a private constructor. It is having a private constructor. Then what we have done, we are using it as a type. We are configuring as a type. And we are implementing the functionality defined inside it. And we are calling this now. That means Oracle.insert. That method is called here. Now I run this here. So again, I'm compiling and running this. So insert is defined with some specific functionality. It's working fine. It is working fine. Now important is here, the constructor. How do we call the constructor of this particular class here? That means the constructor is not called. So here the functionality is saying record inserted. We need to call the constructor of that class here. That means we need to call it. So here, how do we call the constructor of the class within that location? That means this construction is private. That means it should be called within the class only. Its definition should be within the class only. So you cannot access outside. You cannot access outside. So that means, for example, within the class, that means suppose here, I'm using when insert, on insert, we are defining this, I'm configuring this. This indicates the current class. And constructor is an anonymous function. Constructor is an anonymous function. So using this keyword, that means just this keyword, or here we are trying to access the database, and we are trying the constructor. You cannot call in this way. We cannot call by using this. I'm just using this keyword. So that means its intention is to configure. So its intention is to configure the current class. And here when I compile this, so in that we are calling that this keyword and compile this, still the constructor is unable to execute. So that means the constructor is defined as private. Then obviously it should be accessible within this class. It is accessible within the class. Generally, if it is an anonymous constructor, so it is not having any reference name, and you are actually generally in many programming languages, this is used for referring to the constructor. But actually that is related to the class. Now here, anonymous functions, how they are called? Generally, anonymous function means, suppose I used, anonymous functions are called with a parenthesis like this actually. That means an empty parenthesis will call the anonymous, it is anonymous type. So that we can't do here because this is not the situation for anonymous. So that means we are trying to access that function here, constructor function here. and that constructor is not accessible within. For that, we need an implementation. I will tell you about that implementation. That means all are related to each other here. So all are related to each other. So I will tell you how we can configure that implementation. Generally, so for that, we need to learn one more rule also related to constructor. I will tell you what is the rule for the constructor. That means how we can define a constructor, right? Let's see. Means what are the rule for the constructor? First point is, first up to this part we will understand. Then we will talk about those additional things about the constructor. So when to use constructor as private? What is your answer? When to use constructor as private? Right? Can you tell me? Generally, constructor private, the purpose of constructor private, that means when you configure that constructor as private. Let's see. Right, fine. Generally, there are 2 points. So, okay, good. So many people have given an answer like a singleton. That is great, good. That is very good, right? That means you are having a good point. That means the constructor, how we define and use them. Now, okay. We are talking about constructor, not member variable. And what is a member variable? Right? Right. Okay. So for this, you need to understand how do we call the constructor. In order to know how do we call the constructor, so you need to understand about generally we need to understand about a singleton mechanism. That is the good point to know about that. So through singleton mechanism, we can access what is the purpose of singleton? I think many of you know that. So singleton is generally, it allows to create only one instance for a class. Am I right? Only one object for a class. Right. It is used for creating only one object for a class. So that means it allows you to create only one object for a class. So here, generally, I have to show you that singleton mechanism. Then you can understand the use of a private constructor. Generally, tell me when we need to create a single instance for class. I think already that point also I told you. When to use a single instance means, yeah, I told you single call, singleton. One point I explained. Am I right? Have I explained that, right? Single call mechanism, singleton mechanism. That means actually, if not just a basic thing here, is generally what is that singleton mechanism? That point is, suppose we have so many clients. We have so many clients. And we have a server. We have a server. Now what we want here is, so here in the server we have some resources. We have some resources. These resources need to be accessed. These resources need to be accessed. These resources need to be accessed. So then by the clients, then what happens is first client makes a request. Now server will create an object for that request. Through that object, it will provide access to that resource. Through that object, it will provide access to the resource. So that means the object is created for the client, and this object is providing the point access to the resource. Now second user requested. When second user requested, then it will use the same object that is created for the first user, and through that it can access the resources. For every request, it will use the same object, and through that it can access that resource. That means object is created only for the first request, and the same object is continued for other requests. This mechanism is called as singleton. This mechanism is called as singleton. I hope everyone understood that. We call this mechanism as singleton, right? That means the object is created only once, and the same object is used across multiple requests, right? So this is singleton mechanism. Can you tell me any real-time example for this? Can any real-time example for this? So how we can manage that? Any real-world example for this? Okay, cache, database connection. Okay. Okay, fine. I'm talking about different clients. So database creation, that means you say that the same database will be used by all the people, same table will be used by all the people. That means you are giving the same connection to everyone. Seriously? Are you going to give the same connection to everyone? Right? So within the application, but here different clients, different clients, am I right? Yeah. Right. Okay. A simple best example that you regularly see, I will tell you. Now, because I am talking everything in detail about the concept, you also thinking very high level and forgetting the basic points, right? You may be thinking like you need to give a very high level answer, right? So you are missing very small basic regular daily used options, right? So all your answers are good. Simple general real world example I will tell you about this type of mechanism. I will tell you. Suppose I uploaded a video on YouTube and nobody has viewed. That means no views. Now suddenly one person watched it. That is the first view. That means a view object is created for that person, and the same object is continued for others also, because views goes on counting from there. Am I right? Understood? That means until or unless anybody started watching it, so the a object for counting the view is not created. Means how many views are there, that is not created. The object for counting the view is not created. Now after once one person visited, watched it, then a view count started, and the same view count will be continued for others also. Am I right? Am I right? It will be viewed by others also. Now important is, that means object is created, the same object is continued for others, and object is created for the first request, and the same will be continued, the same will be continued, right? That is what actually the point, so the concept actually, that is singleton. Generally what is to create such singleton mechanisms, so we need constructors as private. So not only that, a private constructor restricts a private constructor restricts extensibility of class. Do you know this? It restricts the extensibility of class. A private constructor will not allow the class to be extended. That means it prevents the class from extensibility. That means once you think that the functionality of the class that you defined is complete, there are no extensions are required for that particular class, then you can create a private constructor and prevent its extension. So it cannot be extended. It cannot be extended. That is actually singleton and options, right? Yeah. So that is the purpose of private constructor. Private constructor. There is another mechanism, single call mechanism. Single call mechanism is nothing but, actually single call mechanism means, I will tell you simple. Single call mechanism, how it works is, now for first client, an object is created. Through that object, it is accessed. Now second request comes, then it will duplicate this object. Another object is created. Through this object, that resource is accessed. That means for every client, a new object is created. Through that object, we are providing access to that resource. This is single call mechanism. We call this as single call mechanism. This is single call mechanism. Single call mechanism. In single call mechanism, what happens is an object is created for everyone. Everyone. Right? An object is created for everyone. And generally, this object is individual for this client. Another client cannot access the details of this object, previous object. Understood? Another client related object. Right? Now, this is what generally people call as a session. You heard about that point, as session. Every client have his own session. Right? Every client have his own session. In web technologies, these are all very general terms. Every client have his own session. So, but the same server, same resource, but it will be only for that particular session. Will be for that particular session, right? That is what actually we call a single call mechanism. This session ends automatically when this user disconnects. And the values of this session are not accessible to another session. Every session will have a unique session ID. Right? So that is single call mechanism. That means private constructors are used to exhibit singleton mechanism. Singleton mechanism. One simple example I will show you how we can handle this, right? For that, we need to learn all this about constructors, right? Detailing the other points that we will see tomorrow, right? So mostly tomorrow we will finish understanding about classes. Then we will discuss about the concept of working with inheritance, polymorphism, and other types of OOP related characteristics, right? So class related basics and functions, how to deal with them, that we will see tomorrow, right? Tomorrow we will complete with constructors and methods. Constructors, properties, and methods. These three things. Accessors already we done. Then we finish this, then we can go into other characters. Mostly three, four more, 4, 5 more sessions, like maximum 4 sessions, we can finish the TypeScript part and we can start to our Angular part, right? We can go into Angular and start working with Angular. So at least 3, 4 sessions it will take to understand these all characteristics of OOP. Then we can conclude that and we can go into Angular. In Angular, you will learn and work with more TypeScript then, right? All the points which are required for TypeScript, we will discuss that. Yeah? Tomorrow we'll continue then, right? Tomorrow we will see about this, right? Yeah.